Christopher Columbus, because when he left he had no idea where he was going. When he arrived he was not at all where he thought he was, and all of that on public funds. So with this caveat, let me give you an economist view of where we are in terms of measuring the performance of cities around the world. And to do that, I will try to use the time allocated to me to address three fundamental issues. One is to describe how cities compete globally, and this is where we mention how with the Smart City Index we try to measure that. Then I will try to identify some of the most urgent current challenges and priorities that cities have to take into account, and I will conclude by indicating some of the major issues that should be tackled in the future to be fully future ready from the point of view of cities. So starting with point number one, what we do every year at IMD is to publish the Smart City Index. This has been the latest incarnation of my own work on global indices, which I started some 25 years ago by developing the Global Information Technology Index, then the Global Innovation Index, then the Global Talent Index, and a few years ago, the Smart City Index. There's a fifth index in the making that you will hear about in a few weeks from now, which is the Future Readiness Index that combines all four. But let's stick to the Smart City Index for now. Our key knowledge partner is WeGo. So we are very much Seoul-centric, and we're very happy and privileged to work with WeGo, which is a worldwide organization and network of cities. So for us, it is the ideal partner to develop what we want to develop. In addition to the Smart City Index, which I will describe in a minute, we also publish on a yearly basis compendiums of case studies. So the first volume was called 16 Shades of Smart, and described the experience of 16 cities around the world at different levels of development regarding their efforts to become smart cities. The second volume was published during COVID and was entitled Cities in Time of Global Emergencies, and we look at both climate concerns, sustainability, and health concerns, typically fighting the pandemic. This is the background of what we do. The index itself is basically a ranking. So when it comes out, which is typically in the spring of every year, what the media around the world notice is the ranking. So they look at this kind of diagram. They look who is coming out first, who is the best city in the world. And we try to limit the enthusiasm for this kind of exercise of ranking by saying the ranking is just the tip of the iceberg. The ranking is an indication. What matters is not about naming and shaming. It's not about saying who are the champions and who are the laggards. It's to give everybody the incentive and the tools to do better. In other words, this index is not an academic exercise. It is meant to be a tool for action. If it is not translated into action by city mayors, by leaders, by municipal teams, but also by citizens, by business, by investors, and by researchers, we have no reason to publish it. We want to be part of the action. So, because this makes the headlines, this is the way the picture looked in the latest edition of 2023 of the index. The top 5, the best students in class were Zurich, Oslo, Singapore, Beijing, Seoul, and Hong Kong. So this shows that first, the city where we are today is part of the champions. We consider the champions to be those who have shown continuous progress over the last 4 years, that is since the index was created. So if a city has been keeping the same rank or improving that rank for 4 years in a row, we call that city a superstar. And this is, for us, the real champions. We're not looking at ranking in one particular year, because that may change. But when you start having time series and you see the evolution over something which is longer than just a couple of years, there is something important clearly happening. So this is the kind of data that we produce. How do we do that? We do that by basically, and I'm simplifying here because the methodology is a little bit complex and will take us a long time to fully explain. But what we provide in the report every year is this kind of double page for each city. On the left side, you have what we call the infrastructure side. On the right side, you have the technology side. But what it boils down to is the following. We don't start with solutions. We don't say regulating traffic is the best thing that smart city can do, or smart grids for electricity is the best thing that smart cities can do. We start with the problems. We start going to the citizens, the businesses, the public sector officials who are involved in the daily management of cities and in living in those cities. And what we ask them is, what are your problems? What is the biggest issue that you think that your city has to face? And in some places it will be traffic congestion. In some others it will be garbage collection. In some others it will be something else. We don't make any judgment about how these issues have been identified. But we go through surveys, we go directly in contact with the local populations of the cities around the world. And once we have an evaluation of problems, which is basically what you have on the left side of this double page, we try to see how technologies have been able to address these issues. And sometimes the answer is, yes, there have been quite a good solution. Sometimes it's starting to show, and sometimes it's not, it's irrelevant. Citizens don't feel that the efforts being made are really addressing their problems. And that gives us the ranking. We combine that with an overall picture because we don't want to compare apples and oranges. So this is why you have the AAAs, for instance, in the case of Oslo, which I chose as the first example. AAAs on the side means this country, Norway, or this city, Oslo, ranked very high in terms of UNDP Quality of Life Index. This way we can compare cities which are operating in the context of rather wealthy economies among themselves, and you can compare cities in other parts of the world where income per capita is not as high in their own right. So we try not to mix apple and oranges and have something to say that should be action-oriented for everybody. And then, of course, because this is a rather complex set of data, we try to summarize that in a way that people can visualize and use in their respective cities. So we use a lot of this kind of graphics that, for instance, the example of Zurich, and we represent with the different heights of different buildings the scores. So whether you look at the price of hiring an apartment or office space, or whether you look at how well traffic is being regulated, number of possibilities of access to social services, etc., you get this visual image that if the building is taller, it means the item it represents is very well addressed by that city. So in the case of Zurich, which is number one in the rankings, you see that you have a skyline. There are very tall buildings. In other parts of the world, you will have smaller buildings, and that's just a visual trick to allow people to remember what is in that complex index. And there are many different ways in which this data can be read depending on what you're interested in. So in the case of Seoul, for instance, We could look at different aspects like affordable housing. Affordable housing, which is on the top right, the bottom right of that slide, has been identified in our survey as one of the main concerns of the population in Seoul. In other words, you have people who are very happy to be living here, but at the same time saying, if my rent was a little lower, I would be even happier. And that's true not just for people who were born and raised in Seoul, it's also a question he asked for to foreigners, to expats who have to choose a place where they want to live because they have decided to work in Seoul. So it's a combination of all these aspects that gives you the complex picture of where a particular smart city is in the index. So I will not spend more time on the methodology. Maybe the discussion will bring us back to it. Let me just move to the second point about what we identify through these measurements as the current challenges and priorities of cities around the world, not just smart cities. What is new about smart cities? The notion of smart cities was born basically in the 1990s. And IBM was the company which is often credited with using the word smart for everything. IBM wanted at the time to build not only smart computers, but to help people and organizations to behave in a smarter way. So it's in that context of a very deep thinking that indeed the idea came up that cities could become smarter. We've moved away from this IBM technology-centric view of smart cities to something which is definitely much more human-centric. That's, I think, the first conclusion that we draw from our own studies. City officials, but also citizens, investors, are more and more interested in seeing the cities develop to the benefit of their citizens, to heighten the quality of life of the citizens. And whether technology is prominent or not is almost secondary. There is clearly a positive, generally positive attitude toward technological solutions. But we have an increasingly high number of organizations, very often non-governmental organizations, who have put their priorities elsewhere, on sustainability, on reduction of income disparities, on diversity, mixing populations of different economies, different economic levels, different social origins. All these concerns are not technology specific. Technology can help, but this is one of the main evolutions we've seen among smart cities since the creation of the concept. A second idea is that in this new dynamics, which is more human-centric, new issues have come to the fore. What type of new issues? Just to take one example, video surveillance. Video surveillance can be described in many different ways. You have positive ways to say, first it helps regulate traffic. If we know how many people are crossing that kind of intersection, we can better time the red light and green light to adapt to the way in which people, cars and pedestrians and bicycles move around the cities. That's one positive aspect. Another one is to say we put a limit to criminality because we can keep an eye on what's happening, and if somebody gets mugged in some dark street, there may be a camera that will tell us what happened. Or if there is an accident, we can determine responsibilities. But there is also, in addition to all these positive ways, a negative way to consider video surveillance as something that limits the freedoms of individuals. And depending on where you are in the world, what kind of cultural environment you are in, the positives versus negatives may be balanced in different ways. We could take multiple examples of that, but it's just one example among many of the kind of new issues that have come up in the context of smart cities and more generally of cities right away. When I say that cities and smart cities in particular are becoming more human-centric as opposed to technology-centric, clearly sustainability is a very, very important pillar, an increasingly important pillar to consider. One of the reasons is just that the majority of mankind has started to live in cities, and that trend will continue. So if we want to address a human-wide issue like the environment and climate change, we have to give priority attention to what happens in cities and how cities are addressing them. So this leaves room for a number of other dimensions, including that of inclusion. Who is going to participate in this kind of efforts? Diversity, innovation, talent mobilization, all of that is part of the new equation of what I call engagement with sustainability. And to finish, what does it mean for the future? I mentioned that the future of smart cities matters for all of us, just because statistically, the majority of mankind will be living in cities. That in itself should be sufficient. But there is more. We have new dynamics of regions versus nation states. Maybe the discussion will bring us back to that, but clearly over the last decade, we've seen a progressive collapse of multilateral discipline. We've seen international trade, international investment, international political relations deteriorating. And very often, and the pandemic was evidence of that, when central government fails, cities step up to the plate. In that context, the conclusion is that being smart is clearly on the set for the future, but there's more than one way to be smart. You can look at it from different angles. Your culture, your history, the geography, demography are things that you cannot change overnight. And these are the pillars on which being smart as a strategy should be built. And all of that has to do with being future ready. So in summary, I can summarize what I just said in 4 letters as the challenges ahead. The C is for climate change. That's clearly a top priority. The I is for inclusion and inequalities that need to be addressed. The T is for transnational systems and cooperation. This is what WIGO is about, for instance. And the Y is for young generation, because the future belongs to them, and they will be the one making the future. Thank you for your attention.
시장님, 답변 잘 들었습니다. 잠시 후에 토론의 시간에 다시 모셔서